When Aaron returned to his childhood home after his father's death, he expected to find dust and silence. What he didn't expect was Miles, his best friend, the man he once loved, and the secret they both buried 20 years ago. Now, face to face again, they'll have to decide: keep running or finally face the truth. The house hadn't changed much, though time had left its fingerprints on every corner. Paint peeled from the shutters, ivy crawled up the porch railings, and the once white front door had faded into a muted gray. The gravel crunched under Aaron's boots as he stepped out of the car and took a long look at the structure that had been both sanctuary and prison in his youth. It had been 21 years since he'd last crossed that threshold. 21 years since he packed up a duffel bag and left without saying goodbye to anyone but his father. And now, that same father was gone, leaving behind only memories, paperwork, and the quiet weight of unresolved things. Aaron stood still for a moment longer, listening. Nothing but wind. No cars. No voices. The silence was heavy, thick, familiar, as if the land itself remembered him, not as he was now, but as he had been then. He unlocked the front door with a rusted key that protested in the lock. The hinges groaned as the door swung open, revealing a hallway bathed in soft, dust-filtered light. The air smelled of old wood, forgotten summers, and something faintly bitter, perhaps grief. Inside, everything had a stillness to it, like a room waiting to exhale. Furniture covered in white sheets stood like ghosts of another era. A half-burned candle sat on the mantelpiece, untouched since winter. Aaron ran his hand along the banister as he walked through the house, touching the memories embedded in the grain. Upstairs, the bedrooms remained frozen in time. His old room was smaller than he remembered, the way childhood rooms always seem when revisited. The wallpaper, once covered in sketches and pinned photographs, was now bare. He sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the creak of the floorboards beneath him. There was a moment, brief and sharp, when he almost called out for someone, a reflex more than anything. But he swallowed the impulse and stood up instead. In the kitchen, he found a note from the attorney confirming the key drop and reminding him of the meeting scheduled for Monday. He placed it back on the counter, next to a pile of unopened mail. The fridge, predictably, was empty except for a dusty bottle of mustard and a forgotten jar of pickles. The afternoon passed in silence. He unpacked lightly. Just a few shirts, his laptop, an old flannel jacket. No photos. No tokens from the life he'd built elsewhere. He wasn't sure how long he'd stay. Just long enough to clear the house, sign the paperwork, and leave again. That was the plan. But plans had a way of bending in places you didn't expect. It was just before sunset when he heard the sound. Not loud. Just a car engine, somewhere down the road, slow and casual like it belonged there. He glanced out the window. The truck parked across the street wasn't unfamiliar. Older model, dark green, some rust on the door. And the man who stepped out of it, tall, broad-shouldered, with a weathered face and that same unhurried gait, made Aaron's breath hitch, though he didn't know why. Not at first. Then the man turned, just enough for the light to catch the edge of his jaw, and Aaron knew. Miles. It was like a photograph suddenly brought to life. A snapshot that had aged, softened, changed. The angles were sharper now, the hair a little thinner. But the presence, that quiet intensity, was the same. Aaron stayed still, hidden behind the window frame, watching as Miles crossed the road with hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the porch. He paused near the steps, looking at the house like it had asked him a question he wasn't ready to answer. Then he walked away, not hurried, not hesitant, just gone. Aaron didn't breathe again until the truck turned the corner and disappeared. He didn't sleep that night. The sheets smelled like cedar and thyme, and his mind refused to rest. Images kept flooding back. Late-night bike rides, half-whispered conversations on the dock, the way Miles had looked at him that final summer. The summer everything shifted, then cracked. They had never spoken about it. Not after. Not even once. In the morning, Aaron made coffee and stood by the window, staring out at the road as if it might offer some kind of answer. The town was waking up slowly. Joggers, mail carriers, the occasional bark of a dog in the distance. He wondered if Miles would come back. And if he did, what he would say. What Aaron would say. For now, he said nothing at all. The next morning, Aaron took the long trail through the woods behind the house, a path carved by childhood steps, softened by years and memory. The trees arched overhead, golden light filtering through early autumn leaves. His boots moved with quiet familiarity, crunching against pine needles and fallen twigs. The silence wasn't empty. It was filled with echoes, distant laughter, the splash of feet in the lake, branches breaking under careless, youthful weight. He walked without urgency, letting the rhythm of the forest guide him. Eventually, he reached the clearing. The lake spread before him, still and glass-like, reflecting the sky in fragmented pieces. The dock was still there, worn, slightly tilted but intact. He stood at its edge, hands in his jacket pockets, letting the cool wind wash over him. This was where everything had happened. Not all at once. Not with a confession or a decision. Just gradually, like the way sunlight fades in the evening. Slow, inevitable, unnoticed until it's gone. He sat on the edge of the dock, legs dangling just above the water. His fingers found a familiar groove in the wood, the same spot he used to tap when nervous. He tapped it now more out of instinct than feeling. They had spent so many evenings here, he and Miles, when everything was simpler and also more complicated. Aaron had never found the words for what passed between them that summer. Not then, not after. Maybe it wasn't about the words. It was about how Miles had looked at him, steady, unafraid. About how close they had sat, knees touching, the space between them charged with something unspoken. It was about that one moment, that night, when neither of them pulled away. And the morning after, when neither said a thing. He closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the years press gently on his shoulders. What would it have meant if they had spoken? Would it have changed anything? Would they have been braver or more afraid? Behind him, a branch snapped. Aaron opened his eyes, turning slightly. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Then the voice, calm, familiar, unchanged in all the ways that mattered. Didn't think I'd find you here so early. Aaron didn't respond at first. He didn't turn around. The presence was enough. It settled beside him with a quiet ease. Miles sat down, leaving just enough space to suggest caution, but not distance. They both stared out at the lake, neither speaking. The breeze moved around them, gentle and watchful. Aaron didn't ask why he was there. Miles didn't explain. It was like the time between them had folded, and they had slipped back into something that never quite ended, only paused. Minutes passed, maybe more. Then Miles stood up and motioned with a slight tilt of his head. Come on, he said, voice low. Aaron followed. They walked through the woods together, saying little. The path was familiar to both of them. It led to a small clearing near the northern edge of the property, where the trees grew tighter, the air cooler, more private. There, behind an old stone wall, was a place they hadn't visited in years. It wasn't marked, just earth, moss, and a single tree that had grown at an angle, like it had been pulled towards something underground. Aaron stood still while Miles crouched near the base of the tree, brushing away leaves and debris. Underneath, something faintly metallic caught the light. An old tin box. Faded, dented, sealed tight. Miles didn't open it. He just looked at it. I didn't think it would still be here, he said quietly. Aaron stepped closer. The box hadn't been touched in decades. He remembered the day they buried it. There had been laughter, a makeshift oath, and something else, the tension neither had been ready to name. They had called it a time capsule. A joke, a dare. But both had known it was more than that. Aaron reached down and brushed his fingers along the lid. The chill of the metal startled him. They didn't open it. Not yet. Instead, they sat on the low stone wall, both quiet, listening to the forest. Aaron didn't know what scared him more, what was inside the box or what might come after. But in that silence, in that space between them, something had shifted again. Not everything that was buried stayed hidden. The third night in the house was colder. The air carried a quiet bite, and the walls, once familiar, now felt like silent observers. Aaron moved through the rooms with slow purpose, turning off lamps, straightening old photo frames, brushing dust for forgotten shelves. He wasn't sure why. No one else was watching. Upstairs, he opened the window in his old bedroom. The breeze drifted in, stirring the thin curtains. Outside, the woods stood like sentinels, dark, endless, alive with whispers. He had avoided the mirror most of the day, but now, as he caught his reflection in the glass, he saw someone he didn't quite recognize. There was tiredness around the eyes, but not just from travel or work. It was the kind that came from holding something in for too long, a pressure that eventually reshaped a person's posture, their speech, even their smile. He leaned closer, studying the lines around his mouth, the small scar beneath his jaw, the way his collarbone pressed against his skin. He looked like a man who had built walls so carefully he'd forgotten what they were keeping out. A knock at the door broke the quiet. Not loud, just enough. He didn't answer, but the door opened anyway. Miles stood there, shoulders slightly hunched, as if the weight of the day clung to him too. He didn't speak, only gestured toward the hallway. Aaron followed. They went downstairs, into the kitchen. The same yellow-tiled floor. The same chipped mug still sitting by the sink, untouched since the morning. Miles poured coffee, though neither of them had asked for it. It was just something to do. They sat at the table like they had done countless times as teenagers, when the house was empty and the world outside didn't seem so close. Aaron kept his gaze on the table. His fingers traced the grain of the wood, slowly, steadily. He thought of everything he hadn't said over the years. The unspoken explanations. The moments where he could have picked up the phone, typed the message, walked across a room. But silence had always felt safer, less real. And now, sitting here beside the man he had spent years trying to forget, he felt that silence closing in again. The memories weren't loud. They came softly, like breath against the back of his neck. That summer night, the dock, the pause before a hand touched his. The electricity in the air, sharp and fragile. The way their shoulders brushed, and neither of them moved away. The single moment when everything cracked open. And then the morning. The absence. The way Miles had looked at him once. Uncertain, scared, and then never again. It wasn't heartbreak. Not exactly. It was something quieter, more enduring. A kind of unfinished sentence that had echoed through every relationship Aaron had tried to build since. He glanced at Miles, who now stared out the window, his hands wrapped around the mug. The light from the overhead fixture carved shadows across his face, softening the years, but leaving their outline visible. Aaron wondered what Miles had carried with him, what silences he'd filled with noise, with travel, with distraction. Whether he had ever told anyone else. Whether this house, this kitchen, haunted him too. Miles finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I almost didn't come back." Aaron didn't reply. He didn't trust his voice. Another pause. I kept telling myself it didn't matter, that it was just a moment. Aaron's hand stilled on the table. Miles looked at him then. Not for long, but long enough. I was wrong. Aaron stood slowly, needing to move. He walked to the sink, gripped its edge, stared down at the empty basin. The air felt too heavy, like it had thickened around them. His voice, when it came, was quiet but clear. I told myself the same. They didn't say anything more. It wasn't necessary. The truth hung between them, not like a wound, but like a thread that had been pulled taut for too long and finally released. It wasn't resolution. It wasn't closure, but it was something. That night, as Aaron lay in bed, he listened to the house breathe around him. The walls no longer pressed in. The silence was no longer empty. Somewhere down the hallway, in the guest room, Miles was asleep or pretending to be. For the first time in years, Aaron didn't feel alone. The morning was slow to arrive. Mist clung to the trees like a memory reluctant to let go. Aaron stood on the back porch, coffee in hand, the ceramic mug warming his fingers while the air cooled his skin. The forest beyond the yard looked both beautiful and endless, as if it could swallow a secret and keep it forever. Behind him, the house was quiet. Miles hadn't come downstairs yet, or maybe he had and left again. Aaron couldn't tell. He didn't ask. They hadn't spoken much since the night in the kitchen. But something had changed, not in what was said, but in what was finally allowed to exist between them, without denial, without dismissal. Aaron set his cup down, and took the old path into the woods. His boots left soft prints on the damp earth. Each step was measured, not out of hesitation, but because the weight of memory made every movement deliberate. He knew where he was going. The clearing was smaller than he remembered, or maybe the trees had grown taller. The low stone wall was still there, half covered in moss, crumbling in places. The air smelled of wet leaves and pine, and something faintly metallic, the echo of rust, maybe, or just imagination. The tin box was still there, partially uncovered now. The wind had shifted the debris, exposing the edge like it, too, was ready to be seen. Aaron knelt beside it, fingers brushing against the lid. The metal was cold. Not surprising, but it felt symbolic somehow, a reminder of how carefully they had sealed that part of themselves away. He didn't open it immediately. Instead, he sat on the stone wall, letting the silence settle around him. It wasn't uncomfortable. It felt earned. Footsteps approached behind him. Steady quiet. Miles sat beside him without a word. Their shoulders nearly touched. Neither reached for the box. It wasn't the contents that mattered. They both knew what was inside. A photograph, folded and faded. A note neither of them had dared to reread. A bracelet Aaron had worn for a single summer. Tokens of a moment they'd promised to forget. But forgetting had never been the problem. It was the remembering that had been too hard to bear. The wind shifted. A bird called out somewhere overhead. Time moved, but the weight of the place remained the same. Aaron finally spoke, voice low, steady. "We thought burying it would erase it." Miles nodded, eyes still on the forest ahead. It didn't. There was no anger, no regret, only truth. Aaron stood, walking slowly toward the tree that had marked the spot all those years ago. Its roots curled over the ground like fingers trying to hold on. He placed a hand on the bark, rough, firm, real. For a long time, he had believed that what happened between them had been a mistake. Not because it was wrong, but because of how it had made him feel. Vulnerable, exposed, alive in a way that frightened him. Now, standing here, he realized it hadn't been a mistake at all. It had been a beginning, one he hadn't known how to follow. He turned back toward Miles, who was watching him with that same quiet patience he had always carried. Without speaking, Aaron stepped forward and reached down. He lifted the tin box from the dirt, brushed it clean, and opened the lid. The photograph was still there, two boys at the edge of the lake, shirts half-soaked, smiles wide and unguarded. Behind them, the sun setting in hues of golden fire. It looked like freedom. The note was folded into quarters. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. The bracelet, a simple woven band of blue and white thread, had frayed along the edges, but held together. Aaron looked at Miles. "I kept waiting for it to go away." Miles's eyes softened. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. They sat together in the clearing for a long time, the box between them, open now, not just literally but symbolically. Eventually, Aaron placed everything back inside and closed the lid. He didn't bury it this time. He sat on the wall and stepped away, not to hide it again, but to let it rest. As they walked back through the trees, side by side, the silence between them felt different. Not heavy, not afraid, just real. The house was quiet again, but not in the same way as before. It no longer felt haunted, just still, as if it was finally allowed to rest. Aaron stood in the hallway, fingers lightly grazing the worn edge of the banister. Afternoon light filtered through the dusty windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Somewhere outside, leaves rustled in the breeze, but inside everything was calm. Miles had left early. No note, no words, just the sound of the door closing softly behind him. Aaron had heard it but hadn't moved. Not right away. He sat on the edge of the bed for a long time after, trying to make sense of the weight in his chest. It wasn't sadness exactly, and it wasn't regret. It was the echo of something unfinished, a question still suspended in the air between them. He walked downstairs, moving without urgency. Every room now felt sharper, more defined, as if their time together had brought the house back into focus. Even the floorboards creaked with a different rhythm. In the kitchen, the sunlight caught something on the table, a small object placed deliberately. It was the tin box, cleaned, closed, intact. Aaron stared at it for a moment, then reached out and opened the lid. Inside, nothing had changed. The photograph, the note, the bracelet. But tucked between them now was something new. A single piece of paper. Folded. He unfolded it with slow fingers. The handwriting was familiar. Unmistakable. I'll be where we left off. If you're ready. No name. No time. But Aaron didn't need more. He exhaled long and steady. He knew where to go. The walk to the lake was quiet, the path gently curving beneath a canopy of gold and green. The breeze was soft, the air cool against his skin. Every step felt deliberate, but unforced, like walking toward a memory he'd finally stopped resisting. The dock came into view slowly, like something from a dream. The lake stretched out in front of it, calm and endless, the water catching the last light of the day. And there, standing at the edge, was Miles. He hadn't changed his posture, hands in his jacket pockets, gaze fixed on the horizon. Aaron stopped a few feet behind, letting the moment settle. There was no dramatic gesture, no rush of words. Just the wind, the lake, the sound of breath. Miles turned, slowly, his eyes meeting Aaron's. No expectation, no pressure, just quiet invitation. Aaron walked the last few steps forward and stood beside him. They looked out across the water, together. The silence between them wasn't tense. It wasn't heavy. It was the kind of silence that follows understanding. Not everything had to be spoken. Some things could simply be known. That night, Aaron didn't sleep in his childhood bedroom. He lay in the guest room, where the walls were unfamiliar and the air held no history. It felt lighter that way. The window was open, letting in the sound of crickets and wind. The stars outside blinked slowly, as if watching. He stared at the ceiling, not counting minutes, not chasing sleep. For once, there was no need to plan, no need to explain. Only the quiet certainty that something long buried had finally been unearthed. Not to be discarded, but to be seen, accepted, and maybe, just maybe, carried forward. In the morning, the light spilled across the floor in soft ribbons. The coffee tasted warmer. The house didn't feel like it belonged to someone else anymore. Outside, Miles stood by his truck, door open, hand resting on the frame. Aaron stepped out onto the porch. They didn't say goodbye. They didn't need to, because this time there was no ending, only a beginning.